figure it out. It all starts with committed instructional leadership. So what do you have in your school, or what will you have in your school that who is going to be able to help you to be able to develop that? Because as teachers, I'm telling you right now, our resources are going to be really, really skimmed. It's going to be hard to be able to get the support that you want. But having a good team that believes in the same vision and has the same passion with helping the kids get to where they need to be and preparing them for high school and getting them college ready is the most important thing, right? So we start that with that committed leadership. Then we go to being able to analyze the information. So we have that informal assessment that most people usually look at to be able to identify students' needs, okay? Then we're going ongoing. We're constantly going in this circle trying to find ways where we can get highly effective teachers that are going to strengthen our students' literacy skills.
I'm sorry?
So, again with the assessment, unfortunately, I know that people are talking about teaching to the test and doing all of these things, but assessments are essential when we want to determine what our students' needs and strengths are, okay? We want to be able to find out what types of things we can do to help them. And the way that we do that, there's different types of assessments that you can do, whether it's informal or formal. There are reading inventories, and most of the time, if you have a reading coach or a reading specialist in your school, the teacher will usually go to that person and say, hey, I need this help. Can you help me determine what I need to do to help my students to be able to understand what they're doing? And if you don't have that support in your school, then there are different types of assessments that you can pull or that you can do, like running records and anecdotals that you can do to be able to help you figure out where your students' needs are. Most students' needs fall in the range of word recognition, whether it's in isolation or whether it's in a sentence. So they can't read a word. They don't know how to decode the word. They lack fluency, so when they're reading kind of like choppy, like a robot. They can't read full sentences the way that it should. And the problem with that is when they're reading like that robot, like assessment, yours too, when they're reading like that, it kind of takes away from the comprehension. So they're too busy trying to figure out what the next word is that it's taking away the meaning from what they're reading. So we want to try to increase fluency. A lot of our students have a hard time when it comes to comprehension, whether it's comprehension when they're reading orally, silently, or when they're just listening, okay? And being able to identify what those are and how we can pinpoint them is going to help us to be able to figure out what tools we're going to need to help students and teach students. So spelling inventories are another good way of being able to figure out whether or not their need is in, graphic phonics. So if you're looking at something that where a student is having a hard time identifying when it should be a short E or a long E, or a silent E is there, but they keep trying to say the silent E. So for example, I worked with a student where she was having a really hard time being able to identify the silent E. And every time she would read a word, or she would say, like, instead of saying snow, it's snow, she would say it's snow-ed. So she would say snow-ed. And every time she'd seen the ED at the end, she wouldn't drop the silent E, and she would say the whole ED. So being able to identify whether or not it's a graphic phonical, like letter by letter, if they're not understanding the sounds that match the letter, because it's a combination of the two, right? They have to be able to see the letter, know what the sound makes, and put those together. And Words Their Way, are any of you familiar with the program Words Their Way? No? So Words Their Way is a really, really good start. It's a program that helps students, especially ELL learners or low-income students who haven't had a lot of exposure to reading material, to help teachers be able to identify where they're miscuing. What is the problem? Is it the vowels? Is it the consonants? How do we put those together to make the sounds that it's supposed to make? Especially when they get to the bigger, higher academic language, where they have those silent vowels, or they have those funky like schwa sounds and things like that, where they're not understanding it. So we have a lot of good material in those books. Words Their Way. It's called Words Their Way. And some schools, if they have the money, they will buy the program. And you can do different things with those programs. You can do word sorts, you help build vocabulary so that they get more exposure to vocabulary and then being able to say it and decode the words when they're actually reading their text. And then, of course, some students lack motivation, and for others it could just be a language ability. So making sure we identify each one of those things and knowing they're not having a hard time reading because they speak Spanish or Korean or whatever. They're having a hard time because they don't like what they're reading. So how do we switch it up and how do we figure out what kind of reading material is going to be something that's going to keep them engaged, that's going to keep them going? The more that we get them to look at reading as something that's fun, the easier it's going to be for us when we have to do those little time frames, those little blocks of instructional content time. That's the hardest part. So if you want to be able to help your kids, you got to first identify if you want to rectify. So again, we're going back a little bit to the assessments. What type of assessments do we use and what can we figure out? How to figure out what our kids' strengths and needs are. So informal assessments, you have your teacher observations, you can do anecdotal records, you can jot down your notes, you can talk to other teams, other teachers. When we're talking about you being able to work together as a team, which is going to be the next slide, how do we get information from other teachers to help us as well, okay? Formal assessments, you have your school-wide standardized tests, you have your group reading assessments when you do your evaluations. And then there are different inventories that you can do. The Jennings reading inventory, Dr. Jennings is actually the department chair at Northeastern for the literacy department. She has her own reading inventories there at Ben's Bookstore that you can pull, or sometimes you can even find them online that'll help you with reading passages and being able to do that. And then there's the Jerry Johns reading inventory as well. So once your students' needs have been identified, you can establish those instructional goals. Okay, I figured out that my student is unable to determine the difference between short and long vowels within word patterns. So now I know my student doesn't know how to do that. What do I do? What's going to be my approach? That could be in word recognition, that could be word recognition in isolation, or in context. So the different approaches, or the different needs that you see with the evidence from those assessments that you do is going to guide you to what instructional approach you should use with those kids. And we're going to get into that a little bit more.